All right, welcome to lesson 2 of the leg module. And in this lesson, we'll briefly discuss the bones and the muscles of the lower leg, where in the last assignment, when it comes to simplification, and even this assignment that you'll do for this lesson, is you'll bring the assignment from the upper leg together with the assignments here for the lower leg, so to kind of complete your leg. We wanted to separate the two just for ease of understanding, but now you'll combine them, and definitely in the simplification video, you'll combine all of them as well. Now, when we look at the bones themselves from the lower leg, we can again identify 4 major bone structures. The first and most obvious one is the tibia. The tibia is this very interesting bone, actually, because it sort of similar to what the sartorius muscle does for the leg, the upper leg. The tibia sort of provides this gestural shape for the lower leg. And it really does, because I use this all the time when I do gestures for my character. When I'm trying to invent like a character, and I'm just going to draw the legs, that is sort of standing, let's say, in a widespread angle, I will enforce those tibia gestures almost, and I will exaggerate them before I add my muscles on top. So it's a really interesting kind of bone that adds interest to the body itself. And so the tibia and its epicondyles on the top side, along with the femur here, what it does, it basically forms the basis for the knee joint. And then the patella sits on top of that. It will still sit in the region of the femur, not the tibia itself, but both of these legs, of course, work in tangent, or both of these bone structures work in tangent to form the knee joint. That's also very important to remember, and something I see mistaken all the time, which we'll go over in the leg simplification as well, is that most of you, when you simplify a leg, you will draw the upper leg like this, and I have to deliberately draw it wrong, and you will instantly go into the lower leg, right? And you're skipping the knee part, right? Essentially here, there's no knee here. And so what you need to keep in mind is that these bones make up a large part of that structure. So there will be a knee portion here completely in between before we head into the lower leg, right? And that's where the patella will sit, and then the tendons across that will sit as well. So that's important to remember, and that's basically this part. It will make up a certain part of the leg, so keep that in mind, because these two bone structures come together and form the knee joint, right? It's not just muscles on top of muscles. And so except for the tibia, we have, of course, the fibula as well. Fibula, again, very similar to what we actually have with the lower arm. Again, these functions kind of mimic themselves as we used to be quadrupeds, right? Going to bipedal, our stature kind of changed, proportions kind of changed, but the function stays relatively the same. So similar to what we have with the ulna and the radius, the tibia will have a smaller bone on the lateral side as well that is called the fibula. And this fibula goes from a thinner sort of bone on top, and then it branches out into a thicker bone that basically forms the outside of your ankle. And so that's also good to remember, that in the structure simplification, the outside of your ankle will be lower than the inside of your ankle. So this is also something, just for the credibility of your designs, that you can definitely keep in mind. Then, just like what we see with the lower arm, we have the same thing with the lower leg, basically, is that these two bones then end in this case, the foot or the hand. And the structure of the foot is, in terms of bones, actually, again, very, very similar to what we see with the hands. We will have the which is called, in this case, the metatarsal bones, not the metacarpal bones, but the metatarsal bones. So all of these little bones structured or grouped together, and then we will go into the phalanges that make up the toes. The only addition that we have here that we don't have with our hands is that we have this larger bone called the calcaneus, And the calcaneus will essentially make up the heel for our foot. So in essence, the foot is more of a three-parter. It's not that big of a deal for you to remember, as we'll go over in the simplification video. But if you want to study this, you, of course, can. Then looking at function, the main thing you should keep in mind when it comes to the mechanical engineering of the joints is that the tibia and the femur work as a hinge joint that allow the legs to hinge forward and backward. Like you can see here, right? It literally hinges around that knee joint. Now, of course, it will primarily be held in place by the tension of the muscles. Again, what I said in the upper leg video is that this patella, which I didn't know as well, we did some when we found that out when we did research, is that the patella actually plays a major function in the ability of the lower or the quadriceps to actually provide leverage strength for the knee extension. So when we want to extend our knee, going from this to this, that patella plays a huge role in tangent with the quadriceps. So that's really interesting to note. Other than that, this is a really important thing to remember as well. It's more of a technical thing to remember, but a large part of the muscles that we have on the lower leg will help in what we call plantar flexion and dorsiflexion. Now, plantar flexion will basically mean going towards the ground. So when we lift ourselves up and we plant our toes on the ground, that's plantar flexion. And when we lift our foot towards our head, basically, or towards our body, that's called dorsiflexion. Something for you to remember. Now, moving on to the muscles, these lower leg muscles are actually fairly simple to break down. On the posterior side of the lower leg, we can identify basically three superficial muscle groups that will dictate the overall form of the lower leg. So these forms on the posterior side will essentially make up the entire mannequinization of the lower leg. And the biggest of all would be the gastrocnemius. So indicated here in green, that gastrocnemius is like the largest muscle that we have on the posterior side. It's a flexor muscle that allows what I was talking about, that plantar flexion of the foot. So making our foot go towards the ground, or at least our toes, right? That plantar flexion is what the gastrocnemius actually helps in and aids in. So it moves away from the body. And this muscle works together with the soleus, so this yellow muscle, to actually perform that flexor function. Then on the lateral side, we have two muscles again. We have the tibialis anterior, which is literally translates towards the front of the tibia, right? So anterior meaning front, tibialis meaning the tibia bone. So we have the tibialis anterior here indicated in purple. And then we have the extensors, and again, we're grouping them together here in red and blue. And what these muscles do is they help with that dorsiflexion of the foot, right? So it means that they move the foot upwards towards the body. These two muscles actually play a huge role in walking, hiking, or kicking a ball. So when you kick a ball, you need to essentially do plantar flexion. To kick a ball, of course, you need to move your foot away from you. But then when you kick the ball, you need stabilization so that foot doesn't just fly away too far, right? So in order to keep that foot stabilized, these extensor muscles actually help provide that stabilization. Again, it's just function. It's not that important for you to know when drawing the body, but it always comes in use when you know a little bit of the function. So that's it for the muscle side. And on the form side, it's relatively easy. And like I said, when we look at the simplification of the form, in this case, very simplified, we can see that the gastrocnemius makes up almost the entirety of that silhouette change. Whereas before we drew that lower leg simply as a tapering cylinder, right? Now we're just adding that gastrocnemius muscle on top, right? I'm exaggerating it here a little bit, but we're just adding that muscle on top to essentially form the mannequinization of that lower leg. When I draw a mannequinization of that muscle, I kind of do it in this wedging form that you see here indicated by Lex as well. I draw this sort of cutout, and then I inflate that. Inflate that cylinder a little bit on top to indicate that gastrocnemius muscle that kind of pokes out on each side. And then I might include the ankle into this as well, like this. And this essentially creates like that cutout for the lower leg. Right? And onto that, we would have like a little part for the knee. And on top of that, we would have the rest of the upper leg. That's important for you to keep in mind, is that when we're drawing these forms, we want to be able to understand their simplification. And in this case, for the lower leg, again, it's just basically a drumstick, a large inflated kind of spherical shape, and then it tapers off into something that's a little bit more thin and cylindrical. Okay, so we'll move on to the recap, and then we'll move on to the assignment. Hey Artleys, welcome to lesson 2 of this module. In this lesson, we'll be focusing on the lower legs and the feet. When we look at the bones of the lower leg, we can identify 2 distinct bones. We see the tibia and the fibula. The superior condyles of the tibia, together with the condyles of the femur, form the knee joint, onto which the patella bone sits. This area is heavily covered by tendons from the quad muscles that we discussed in the previous lesson. Interesting to note is that the tibia has quite a curve that contributes to the gesture of the leg. When I draw my legs, I like to overestimate or exaggerate this curve to form a little bit more gesture in my legs. The fibula is a smaller bone on the lateral side of the lower leg that forms the outer ankle on your foot. Mechanically, the tibia and femur work as a hinge joint that allows the leg to hinge forward and backwards. Again, held primarily in place by the tension of the muscles. The patella's main function is to provide extra leverage strength for the knee extension to the quad muscles, making the quads up to 50% stronger. When we look at the feet, we can primarily see bones. And similar to the hands, these exist out of various small bones that sit around the hinge joint of the tibia, the metatarsal bones, and the phalanges of the toes. One addition to the feet is a bone called the calcaneus, which essentially makes up the heel of your foot. Moving on to the muscles, the lower legs are fairly simple to break down. On the posterior side of the lower leg, we can identify 3 superficial muscle groups that will dictate the form of the leg. The biggest being the gastrocnemius, a large flexor muscle that allows plantar flexion of the foot, meaning away from the body or towards the ground. This muscle, together with the soleus and other extensors, form the chief plantar flexors of the body. On the lateral side of the leg, we can identify the tibialis anterior, literally the front muscle of the tibia. This muscle serves as the most important muscle to dorsiflex the foot, meaning towards the body or upwards, and plays an important role in walking, hiking, or kicking a ball because it needs to stabilize your foot. So when it comes to form, the most notable thing to remember is the gastrocnemius. Again, this muscle could be regarded as a large drumstick and sits at the back of the lower leg. The other muscles of the lower leg will not play a huge role in the silhouette of the leg simplification and are best combined into cylindrical shapes of the bones. To practice this, we want you to do the following assignments. Trace over 5 of the images we provide in this lesson, clearly indicating where the muscles sit on the body and what their volume is. Lastly, you will add this muscle on top of 5 of your assignments from the upper leg lesson to essentially complete each leg 5 times. That's it, Artleets. We hope you have fun, and we'll see you in the next one.